Your Holiness. Jonathan Roumie spoke gently, his voice so calm, so composed, yet it sliced through the Vatican studio like a bolt of silent lightning. What if everything we've ever taught about the afterlife is only the beginning? Pope Leo XIV froze. Not visibly at first, but then came the tremors. His hands, so steady across decades of papal service, began to tremble uncontrollably. 40 years of theological certainty, cracked then shattered in front of millions of stunned viewers across the globe. His gold-rimmed glasses slipped down the bridge of his nose, catching glints of studio light. Tears began forming in the corners of his eyes, not from sadness or fear, but something far more mysterious. And yet, what Jonathan Roumie said next would make the Holy Father forget the cameras even existed. Behind the scenes, Vatican media staff scrambled whispers, red lights, signals. But none of that mattered. The Pope, stunned, slowly removed his glasses, his fingertips barely holding steady as he wiped the lenses with a trembling cloth. I need a moment, he whispered. The words were barely audible through the boom mics, but the entire studio, and perhaps the world, heard the depth of them. A lifetime of sermons, of sacraments of silence. And now, this moment. Jonathan leaned forward, just slightly, his presence steady, radiating the same quiet authority that had captivated audiences around the world in his portrayal of Christ. The interview, originally scheduled as a light 30-minute segment on faith and entertainment, was now drifting into sacred territory, and no one dared to interrupt. Cardinal Martinez, watching from the control room, gestured furiously to technicians to cue the next segment. But Pope Leo was lost in another place entirely. He stared only at Jonathan, eyes wide, not with skepticism but longing. "Mr. Roumie," the Pope said at last, voice just beginning to rebuild its strength. "In my 40 years of service to the Church, I have counseled thousands about eternal rest. But the way you just described it," he paused, and for a moment the entire studio held its breath. Maybe even you watching this now feel the weight of that pause. What would you say if a lifetime of belief was suddenly lit from behind by a new kind of light? The journey that led Jonathan Roumie to this moment began not in Rome, but in a quiet little chapel outside Chicago 3 years ago. He had been on set filming scenes for The Chosen when something happened. Not scripted, not planned. During a break between takes, he knelt before a simple wooden crucifix. No cameras, no lighting, just silence. And then, light. He later described it not as a vision, nor a voice, but an experience. A wave of something vast, warm, and full of love. So overwhelming it left him speechless for hours. That moment forever changed how Jonathan saw faith. And now he was sharing it not with a priest or a pastor, but with the Pope himself. "Your Holiness." Jonathan continued, voice humble yet clear. "I've come to believe that our earthly understanding of heaven is like a child trying to comprehend the ocean while holding a single drop of water." The Pope inhaled deeply, slowly. The tremors hadn't stopped, but now they carried something else yearning, and across 60 nations millions watched. Not a performance, but a moment of real-time spiritual transformation. Not a sermon, but a reckoning. Jonathan pressed on gently. 3 years ago during prayer, I felt something I can't describe. Not a voice, not a vision, but a knowing. That eternal peace isn't about rest or reward. It's about becoming who we really are for the very first time. The Holy Father leaned forward, his heavy robes whispering against the arms of his chair. Continue, he urged softly. The tone was unmistakable, a mixture of papal gravity and childlike wonder. Later, the Vatican's technical director would say, "In 40 years of broadcasting, I have never seen His Holiness like that. Not once. Commercial breaks forgotten, segments ignored, viewers glued unmoving." Jonathan continued, "I began to understand that heaven isn't a final place of eternal rest. It's a place of eternal becoming. Each soul growing endlessly, exploring endlessly, loving without limit, understanding without walls." His words didn't try to impress. They simply rang true. And maybe you watching now can feel that truth too, somewhere in your chest, just behind the ribs. The Pope didn't respond immediately. He sat in profound silence. But his expression spoke volumes, contemplation and hope. All of this, the unscripted broadcast. The fragile sacredness of the moment had started with a single letter. 6 months earlier, Jonathan had sent it. A message to the Vatican. Not a request for attention. Not a pitch. Just the truth of what had happened to him. Cardinal Martinez at first had dismissed it. Another actor with a vision. But there was something in the tone, something sincere, something that made its way quietly to the Pope's personal secretary. And now, here they were. It was the Pope himself who had requested this interview, captivated by Jonathan Roumie's unconventional perspective. And now he was hearing the young actor pose a question that seemed to echo through centuries of theology. "But, Your Holiness," Jonathan said softly, "what if the traditional concept of eternal rest misses the point? What if the soul does not rest in heaven at all, but instead begins an endless vigil?" Once again, the Pope's hands shook. Not from fear, not from weakness, but from the staggering weight of a possibility that had never been carefully considered. A truth that could challenge and perhaps illuminate everything he had ever taught. Around the Vatican studio, cardinals and advisors exchanged anxious glances. This was no longer a warm exchange about faith in cinema. They were witnessing a theological journey, overturning what seemed unchangeable. And still, no one dared to interrupt. The Pope did not lose his composure. On the contrary, he was absorbed in every word Jonathan spoke, as if a door were opening inside his own soul. Jonathan continued, his voice softening to an ancient whisper. "As ae." In that prayer, I understood that each soul will have eternity to explore the infinite layers of God's being. It was no longer a rest from earthly labors, but the beginning of the real work, understanding divine, infinite love. The Pope closed his eyes. His lips moved slightly in silent prayer, not in rebuttal, not in doubt, but in reception. The technician in the control room stared at the monitoring chart. The viewership was soaring. social media exploded Pope, and Jonathan trended worldwide. On phone screens, in clips shared everywhere, the Pope's eyes were filled with tears and genuine emotion. It was like nothing we'd ever seen before. And maybe you're feeling it too, right here. As the audience watched with hearts pounding, religious scholars from around the world began to chime in. The articles, the commentaries, the theological analysis programs began. But even the most learned minds admitted, we have never seen a moment like this. You speak of infinite growth, the Pope said, opening his eyes, looking directly at Jonathan with a burning focus. So, you say that even in the blessedness of heaven, the soul continues to change, continues to learn, continues to become more than it is. His voice was like the sound of an early bell, quiet, yet far-reaching. The astonishment in his eyes was not resistance, but a thirst for discovery. Jonathan nodded, his expression still humble, but firm. Exactly. Your Holiness. What if the true joy of eternal life is not in reaching an end point, but in beginning an infinite journey of discovery? The words rang out not only in that solemn room, but it seemed through the electronic waves into every heart that was silently searching for something deeper. The Holy Father listened intently. His gaze seemed to gaze into a distant space where old questions melted before the light of a new possibility. And if you who are listening to this story feel your heart moved by the vision of a God who constantly invites souls into eternal love, leave a comment with 3 words, I believe. You are not alone. You are participating in a timeless dialogue. The silence in the studio was almost sacred. Not just silence, but a silence so profound as if the 2 men were listening, not just to each other, but to something beyond words. The journey that had led to this moment had not been accidental. Jonathan had not been in a rush to share what he had experienced. After the vision, he had turned to the Bible, to theological works, ancient and modern, from Thomas Aquinas to Hans Urs von Balthasar. He had studied, prayed, taken notes, not to confirm what he had seen, but to understand. And it was that humility that opened up a horizon for him, that maybe the traditional descriptions of heaven were not wrong, but they were insufficient because they were limited by human perception, not by divine revelation. The thought moved Jonathan and filled him with awe. You are saying, the Pope said in a breathy voice, that heaven is not a state of completion, but the eternal beginning. He was silent. The thought did not pass in one go, but like waves of theology it swept through the Pope's mind. In the control room, the cardinals stood still. They could see that the Pope's hands were shaking more, not from fear, but because he was standing in the presence of a new kind of revelation, a new, profound, spiritual kind of understanding. Jonathan did not rush. He responded with the same familiar gentleness that had moved millions of people to Jesus on screen. Ah, Your Holiness, what if each soul entering eternal joy were not the end of its journey with God, but the beginning of the adventure for which we were truly born? The Pope's chest rose with each deeper breath. He was not just listening, he was receiving. Around the world, millions were watching a theological dialogue that crossed all religious boundaries. Protestants, Orthodox Jews, Muslims, and even atheists all silently watching. A conversation that could change how we view the afterlife, While Vatican protocol officials grew increasingly concerned about the broadcast's length and sensitive doctrinal content, Cardinal Martinez simply shook his head and gestured with his hand. No one interrupts. He understood what was happening could not be interrupted. And the Pope. He seemed oblivious to the camera, the time, or the script. He was on a journey of discovery, one he himself had not expected. This knowledge came to you through prayer. The Pope asked, his eyes never leaving Jonathan. There was no doubt in the question, just the genuine interest of a mind that was always searching for the truth. How can you be sure that these thoughts are from God and not from yourself? It was not a test. It was a plea for authenticity. Jonathan thought for a long moment, then replied in a steady but profound voice, Your Holiness, I can only say that the experience carried with it a truth beyond anything I had ever imagined. It was as if I had been peering through a door that I had not even known existed. There was no fanfare, just absolute honesty, and it was there. Viewers sensed it. The simplicity, the authenticity that they had loved in the role of Jesus was now clearly present in the real him. The Pope took off his glasses again, but this time he didn't wipe them. He put them aside. Then he leaned forward. His heart and his mind seemed to be simultaneously absorbed in Jonathan's words. You are painting a vision, he said slowly, where souls are not only present in the love of God, but also participate in the understanding of His infinite nature. His voice was both excited and reserved, because he knew this idea, if taken seriously, could force traditional doctrine into a rediscovery. Backstage, the Vatican social media team sat glued to their screens. Global engagement was breaking records. Religious leaders across the spectrum began posting responses, mostly not arguments, but expressions of wonder and concern. A new hashtag emerged spontaneously, Ars Eternal Becoming. No one planned it. Just people were trying to grasp the spirit of what they had just heard. What surprised me most, Jonathan continued, was the realization that spiritual growth on earth is not preparation for heaven, but the beginning of what we will do throughout eternity. And you watching this story, ask yourself, is every wish, every prayer, every effort to love in this life the beginning of a never-ending spiritual life? If it resonates with you, leave a simple comment below, I believe. Not because you're certain, but because you have begun to listen. The Pope's face was now deep in thought. The idea that spiritual growth does not end with death but continues forever in heaven seemed to have touched a sacred place in his own personal faith. Jonathan's inner journey had not been a fleeting moment. Since the vision, he had lived in silent prayer study and consultation with spiritual directors. He had immersed himself in mystical theology, poring over ancient and contemporary works, listening and conversing with God with every breath. And after months of being immersed in that divine light, Jonathan knew this was no longer an option to keep to himself. It was a sacred duty to be shared. He is suggesting, the Pope said more forcefully this time, that the beatific vision may not be static, but a journey that is always moving. The word beatific vision rings like an ancient bell, an idea once defined as a final, complete, absolute state. And now, it is being rediscovered as a living, infinitely expanding journey. You who are watching now can feel it. the boundary between tradition and revelation being stretched not to destroy, but to illuminate. The Pope's lifelong scholarly mind seems to be awakened to possibilities never explored in scholastic teaching. Jonathan, now more steadfast, nods respectfully. Your Holiness? What if the beatific vision is not just seeing God, but learning to see with his eyes, growing in the capacity to understand and participate in divine love? The Pope's response is immediate. He raises his hand and places it lightly on his left heart, a gesture that is anything but formal. That gesture was an admission. It was being touched in the deepest part of the sacredness of the life of faith itself. Cardinal Martinez would later recount that he had never seen the Pope so deeply immersed in a theological dialogue outside of private study sessions. The usual diplomatic composure was now gone, replaced by the genuine emotion of someone who had just heard something he had been waiting for all his life without even knowing it. The program structure had long since been abandoned. The schedule, the commercials, the punchline. All of it was meaningless in the face of a theological exploration that was both ancient and revolutionary. This changes the whole way we understand the process of holiness, the Pope murmured more to himself than to Jonathan. If heaven is eternal growth and not eternal rest, then every moment of spiritual growth on earth becomes incredibly important. The excitement in his voice was rising. Every theological building block he had lived by, now not crumbling, but expanding, illuminating. And the sense that this might be the path God had been leading all along, it was just that no one had been quiet enough to listen. Jonathan responded still with his trademark humility. Exactly, Your Holiness. Every act of love, every forgiveness, every step closer to the heart of God is not just a preparation for the afterlife. It is the beginning of the journey of eternity. The Pope's face now held a strange light, a mixture of amazement, gratitude, and peace. A conviction that came not from academic logic, but from an inner being lit by truth. All over the world, viewers were witnessing theology come to life. Not in a pulpit, not in a book, but in a sacred, genuine conversation between two people led to the right moment. Vatican technicians later confirmed that this dialogue had the highest live viewership in the history of the Vatican broadcast. Catholic bloggers, Protestant pastors, even non-Christian scholars all wrote in. The hashtag JAS Eternal Becoming continues to grow, no longer just a trend, but an invitation. Some seminaries have announced they will offer courses on the theology of heaven as infinite growth. Pastors are starting to plan to share what they are witnessing because they know this is not just an interview, it is a turning point. You are describing, the Pope said slowly, a heaven where the soul does not attain perfection, but progresses toward it infinitely. And you who are listening, ask yourself, is eternal life not a reward, but an opportunity to enter more deeply into the very love of the one who created us? If that resonates with your heart, you are not alone. Leave 2 simple words below, I believe. Because the spiritual journey, no matter where it begins, is still ongoing. The Pope's face, normally so composed and serene, now bore the marks of something far deeper contemplation that seemed to tremble at the edge of revelation. He sat quietly processing the immense shift in perspective that had just been offered. a vision of eternity, not as a completed destination, but as an ever-deepening journey. This idea resonated with something buried in his own spiritual memory. You could almost see his heart weighing every syllable. Jonathan's own path to this moment had been no less remarkable. For 3 years, he had devoted himself to intense spiritual formation, immersed in prayer, consulting theologians, learning under seasoned spiritual directors. But it wasn't just study, it was discernment. Long, slow, sacred, listening to God's voice, testing every insight against scripture and tradition. What emerged wasn't a desire to disrupt, but a quiet conviction that he had to share this vision, that it was not merely allowed, but required. Mr. Roumie, the Pope said, slowly, his voice gathering strength. You're suggesting that the beatific vision, our final union with God, is not static, but dynamic. The term fell like sacred thunder in the room. For those listening closely, that phrase alone opened entire theological dimensions. This wasn't abstract speculation, it was a challenge to centuries of spiritual assumptions. The Pope, trained in rigorous scholastic theology, now leaned forward like a man rediscovering fire. The thought animated him, stirred something buried beneath layers of doctrine. The studio, once sterile and quiet, now felt charged alive. Something was happening not just on camera, but in spirit. Jonathan's voice held clarity and warmth. Your Holiness? What if heaven isn't like looking at God, but learning to see with God's eyes? What if eternity is the ongoing expansion of our capacity to understand and share divine love? It hit like a drumbeat to the soul. The Pope, who had heard every theological argument under the sun, suddenly pressed a hand to his chest, not out of pain, but as if to still something fluttering too wildly within. His eyes glistened, not with tears, but with awe. Later, Cardinal Martinez would say he'd never seen the Holy Father this alive outside of private prayer. His usual papal composure had given way to something deeply human, genuine wonder. Viewers across the world felt it too. The technical director would later report that this segment had the highest sustained viewership in Vatican broadcast history. On social media, religious scholars and influencers scrambled to interpret what they were witnessing. Some called it a turning point. Others simply sat in stunned silence, watching two men, one a pope and one an actor, stand at the edge of sacred possibility. This changes everything, the Pope murmured half to himself. If paradise is not eternal rest, but eternal growth, then every single moment of spiritual progress on earth becomes infinite in meaning. You listening at home, have you ever thought of it like that? That your quiet acts of kindness, your efforts to forgive, your hunger to know God's heart, might not just echo into eternity but build it. Jonathan nodded. Exactly, Your Holiness. Every moment of forgiveness, every small act of love is not just preparation for eternity, it is eternity, the beginning of it. You could see it in the Pope's face. This was no longer theology. It was personal. What unfolded next felt less like an interview and more like a shared pilgrimage into divine mystery. The questions weren't rehearsed. The format had dissolved. In its place was something raw, holy, and new. You're describing, the Pope said softly, a paradise where souls don't simply arrive at perfection but grow toward it forever. It was a paradigm shift. His theological foundations were not being destroyed, but expanded, breathed into. Jonathan leaned forward, his tone reverent. What overwhelms me is the implication that every soul's journey is unique. That heaven won't flatten us into sameness, but celebrate our distinctiveness in the eternal exploration of God's nature. The Pope looked stunned, not by disagreement, but by the sense that he was seeing something true for the very first time. Even in the studio, the atmosphere was shifting. You could feel it. Staff members stopped pretending to do their jobs and simply watched. Even the camera operators, hardened professionals, seemed transfixed. They knew they were capturing something historic, something eternal. The Pope turned toward Jonathan again. Mr. Roumie, you're suggesting that the communion of saints isn't just fellowship, but collaborative exploration of divine truth. Jonathan's eyes lit up. Yes, Your Holiness. What if the saints aren't only praying for us, but growing through their intercession? What if prayer links the church on earth and in heaven in dynamic, mutual transformation? If you're watching this, I invite you to sit with that idea for a moment. That your prayers may teach the saints, that their love may grow through loving you. The Pope's face softened into astonishment. It was as if an entire new landscape had opened before him. Across the Vatican, emails were flooding the press office. Scholars were beginning to piece together responses. Journalists were scrambling to get official statements. Was this new doctrine a dangerous idea or something ancient? Finally spoken aloud. This means the Pope said, his voice low and steady, that our spiritual lives don't just affect us, they contribute to the ongoing life of heaven. Let that settle in. Your love, your growth, your struggle, it matters not just here, but there, eternally. Jonathan spoke again. The years of portraying Jesus in The Chosen, having carved in him a deep familiarity with divine love and human potential. His insights weren't performative. They came from fire, from formation, from surrender. What strikes me most, he said, is how this vision redefines the value of every earthly act of love and service. Each one becomes eternally significant, not as a reward, but as contribution to God's unfolding revelation. And for a moment, the Pope simply closed his eyes. And in that silence, a truth was blooming. The sheer weight of this theological distinction stirred something deep within him. All his life, his seminary training had spoken of heaven as a completed reality, a fixed, serene state of eternal stillness. But Jonathan's vision? It introduced a startling alternative, a dynamic eternity, pulsing with motion discovery and sacred curiosity. It felt not only more alive, but somehow more in harmony with the nature of divine love itself. This wasn't just a spontaneous idea birthed in private reflection. No, Jonathan had walked a long, rigorous path to reach it, one paved with years of prayer, scholarly engagement, and consultation with spiritual directors and respected theologians. For 3 years, he tested these insights against the bedrock of Scripture Catholic orthodoxy and the witness of the saints. And the fact that his conclusions passed these trials, that they were as faithful as they were revolutionary, had convinced him this wasn't personal invention. This was holy guidance. And now, before the Vicar of Christ himself, Jonathan dared to speak it aloud. What overwhelms me, Jonathan said softly, is the implication that each soul's eternal journey will be utterly unique. Because each of us will bring different gifts, different longings, different angles of vision to the infinite exploration of God's nature. Dear viewers, can you imagine that? An eternity not of sameness, but of splendid variety, where your own soul brings something irreplaceable to heaven's unfolding revelation. The Pope's expression, once measured, was now awash with wonder. The vision he was being presented of heaven, not as a destination but as a beginning, struck a chord deep within him. For the first time in years, he was seeing the afterlife, not through doctrinal diagrams, but as a living symphony in which every soul played a part, and he wasn't alone. Around the papal studio, something rare and electric was unfolding. Cameramen, sound technicians, assistants, even members of the Swiss Guard, stood still, captivated. They had started the day filming an interview. Now they felt like they were witnessing a moment of history, one whose echoes might reach far beyond the marble halls of the Vatican. "Mr. Roumie, the Pope," said suddenly, voice trembling with anticipation, "are you suggesting that the communion of saints involves not only fellowship, but collaborative discovery of God's truth?" The question hung in the air, alive and reverent. Jonathan's response was filled with light. "Yes, Your Holiness. What if the saints are not only interceding for us, but growing themselves, learning more about God by participating in our lives through prayer? What if intercession is a two-way bridge of growth?" Friends watching at home, have you ever thought of prayer that way? Not just as sending a message upward, but as forging a living bond across eternity that enriches both sides. The Pope's reaction was unmistakable. His face, opened eyes, widening jaw slightly slackened, as if Jonathan's words had gently unlocked a door he'd been pressing against for decades. And what lay beyond that door? A vision of heaven as vibrantly connected to earth as a place still becoming. Meanwhile, outside the studio, the tremors of this conversation were being felt across the world. The Vatican's press office was fielding calls from major networks. Theological faculties at universities across continents were buzzing with speculation. Twitter theologians and seminary bloggers, even atheist commentators were passing the footage with fascination. The conversation had jumped the fence of Catholicism and was now galloping freely through the global conscience. Inside, the Pope leaned forward, visibly moved. "This understanding," he said slowly, "suggests that our spiritual growth here contributes not just to our own salvation, but to the ongoing life of heaven itself." He paused as if hearing his own words for the first time. "The implications are vast." Jonathan nodded quietly, offering no interruption. He knew the Holy Father was walking through sacred terrain, and sometimes silence is the holiest guide. At this point, the Pope looked at Jonathan not as a guest or even as a scholar, but as a fellow traveler. His eyes shone with intensity, not of certainty, but of hopeful wonder. "Your background in playing Christ," he said, "has clearly brought you closer to understanding the nature of divine love. But what you're describing now, this goes beyond art." Jonathan smiled humbly. "The chosen prepared me, yes. But these insights weren't from the script. They came through prayer, through real tears, through listening. What came next shook even the seasoned Vatican crew. This vision, Jonathan said, voice thick with feeling, means that every act of love, every tiny unseen kindness echoes in eternity. Because love is not just the means to heaven, it is the substance of heaven itself. And right there, the Pope gasped not theatrically, but in the way someone gasps when truth brushes against their ribs. Hands over his heart, eyes wet with tears, he didn't bother to hide, he whispered, "Love is the activity of paradise." Viewers, how does that strike you? Have you ever wondered what we'll be doing in eternity? Worship, yes. Rest, yes. But what if we are also building, loving, exploring, and being transformed forever? Later, Cardinal Martinez would remark that he hadn't seen the Holy Father so visibly animated since his days as a theology student. The joy in the Pope's face wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't diplomatic. It was real. This wasn't doctrine. This was discovery. As the interview progressed, the Pope's theological mind was dancing, making connections, recalling scripture, echoing church fathers. And yet, nothing felt like dry academia. The entire dialogue shimmered with a sense of holy relevance. "What moves me most?" the Pope said, voice firm with sacred conviction, is that this vision makes the resurrection not just about eternal life, but about eternal becoming. And with that, he stood, literally stood, not ceremonially, but as if his very bones couldn't bear the wonder of sitting still any longer. "Mr. Roumie," he said with a warm, almost mischievous smile, "you're suggesting that eternal life is not the end of growth, but the ultimate fulfillment of it." Jonathan's eyes glistened. "Your Holiness." "Yes, that is exactly what I believe." As the conversation neared its crescendo, it was no longer just two men speaking. It was two hearts, one of the shepherd, one of the artist, co-laboring to uncover a vision of eternity, so compelling that millions watching felt as if heaven had drawn a little closer. And you, dear viewer, if you've stayed with us this long, what do you think? Does this vision stir something in your soul? Because we believe it's just the beginning. The air in the studio had taken on a strange, sacred weight, almost as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. As the Pope and Jonathan continued their exchange, there was a kind of stillness that wasn't just silence, but reverence. Later, Vatican staff would report sensing something they could only describe as otherworldly, a presence that went beyond theological excitement and touched the very marrow of the spiritual. And friends, if you've ever had a moment in your own life that felt like the veil was pulled back just a little, you might understand what they were feeling. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his voice tinged with awe. "What overwhelms me? Your Holiness, is this: if souls grow eternally, then God's joy in creation must be infinite too. Because He's eternally discovering new expressions of love and beauty through His children." The Pope didn't speak at first. He simply brought a hand to his heart, eyes glistening. That single thought, God's joy being endlessly renewed through us, seemed to strike some deep chord in his spirit. And maybe in ours too. This wasn't theology drawn from ivory towers. This was 2 lives' worth of pilgrimage, one through the path of portraying Christ on screen, the other through decades of pastoring Christ's flock. Their words were forged from experience, not abstraction. Jonathan continued with his usual gentle humility. Your Holiness. This idea doesn't shrink the mystery of eternity, it expands it. Eternity isn't a room we enter, it's a world we forever explore. The Pope closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with a kind of brightness that made even the camera crew catch their breath. This, he murmured, this transforms our understanding of paradise, not as a destination, but as a divine journey. You could almost hear a pin drop. Somewhere deep in the Vatican, transcripts were being requested. Cardinal secretaries were whispering to one another in urgent tones. Theologians were already opening ancient texts, scribbling notes in the margins. A moment of theological evolution was unfolding in real time, and the entire church was beginning to stir. The Pope leaned back, visibly moved his voice low but powerful. This changes how we view salvation, not as static reward, but as eternal participation. And it gives new purpose to every heartbeat we have on earth. And dear listener, can you feel that too? That maybe your life, your struggles, your joy, your learning, all of it is not just for now, but woven into something that echoes forever. Jonathan simply nodded. His portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen had demanded more than acting. It had demanded a deep entering into the heart of Christ, a communion with something far beyond script. Now that same depth was pouring through his words, not as performance, but as witness. Across the globe, clips of the interview had already begun to spread like wildfire. Professors were rewriting syllabi. Priests were preparing homilies. Podcasts buzzed with words like revolutionary, orthodox, and sacred. And ordinary believers were messaging one another with quiet awe. Did you hear what he said? Did you feel what that meant? And then came one of the Pope's most stunning lines. He turned toward Jonathan, his voice infused with something radiant and unwavering. Mr. Roumie, you've helped me see that the gospel promise of abundant life doesn't stop at the grave. It unfolds infinitely. The air in the studio had shifted. It was no longer just a recording space. It had become something sacred. As Jonathan and the Pope continued their conversation, the atmosphere turned electric with spiritual gravity. Vatican staff later said they sensed a presence, something unexplainable, yet undeniably holy, hovering during the interview. It felt like heaven was listening in. Jonathan's voice, calm yet awestruck, carried the weight of a man whose soul had brushed the edges of eternity. What overwhelms me, he said, is realizing that if the soul grows forever, then God's joy never ceases. His happiness in us never plateaus. Creation isn't finished, it's always discovering new expressions of divine love through us. The Pope's eyes glistened. That idea that God's joy is infinite, because we are infinite, seemed to awaken something deep within him. His expression softened into one of reverence and awe, as if a mystery he'd long held close had just begun to unfold in dazzling new light. Let's pause here for a second, dear viewers. Imagine what it must feel like for the Pope himself to be surprised by God again. To be moved not by duty or doctrine, but by the raw wonder of what it means to be eternally known and eternally becoming. The journey that had brought them both here wasn't accidental. Jonathan's path, shaped not only by his role in The Chosen, but by years of study, solitude, and sacred searching, had equipped him with a spiritual vocabulary few actors and few theologians possess. The Pope, for his part, had lived through decades of pastoral intimacy with the suffering and the searching. And now, these two roads were converging. Your Holiness. Jonathan said with humble fire in his eyes, this understanding doesn't shrink eternity, it expands it. Paradise isn't a place we reach and stop. It's an infinite adventure into the heart of God. The Pope leaned back in his chair, stunned but not afraid. His mind, trained for decades to pass the complexity of divine mystery, was now raising to connect these revolutionary insights with ancient truths. This changes everything, he whispered. Not just how we understand heaven, but how we live on earth. Word of the interview was already spreading. Cardinals were requesting early transcripts. Theologians were buzzing with excitement and confusion. Some called it dangerous. Others called it a breakthrough. But no one could ignore it. Let's be honest. Viewers, when was the last time you heard Vatican scholars use the word breakthrough? The Pope turned again to Jonathan. You're showing me, he said, that every single moment here on earth, every conversation, every act of mercy, every quiet prayer echoes into eternity. Nothing is wasted. Everything becomes part of God's great love story. Jonathan smiled, deeply moved. That's what discipleship is, he said. Not a training for rest, but a preparation for eternal adventure. That line alone, eternal adventure, sparked something seismic in the Pope. He sat forward, suddenly energized. His pastoral instincts, honed over decades, were firing. He saw how this vision could revive weary priests, inspire new generations, and restore meaning to millions seeking purpose in a suffering world. Cardinal Martinez would later say he had never seen the Pope so alive during a theological discussion, not in 15 years. This vision, the Pope said, slowly changes everything. The communion of saints, the power of prayer, the mission of the Church itself. And it was true. As the words left his lips, theologians worldwide were already preparing responses. Interfaith leaders were opening unexpected dialogues, and seminaries were scrambling to fit this moment into next semester's curriculum. What moves me most, Jonathan said as their conversation neared its close, is this: no two souls will experience eternity the same way. Each will explore God's love uniquely. Every person contributes their own melody to the eternal symphony of divine becoming. The Pope's eyes welled again. That thought of each soul offering something irreplaceable to the heart of God touched him like nothing else had. A long silence filled the studio. No one moved, not the cameraman, not the aides, not even the Vatican guards. And then suddenly, the Pope stood. It was unscripted. His hands trembled. His face was radiant. He walked toward the great window overlooking St. Peter's Square, lost in thought, as if the centuries were bending around him. Mother of God, he whispered, his voice cracking. If this is true, if souls never stop growing, then love. Love is truly infinite. He turned back toward Jonathan, tears streaming. And what happened next stunned the world. The Pope walked, no rushed forward. His arms opened. And in front of millions watching live, he embraced the actor who had come, not just to play Jesus, but to bring a piece of eternity with him. You've given me back the wonder, the Pope said, his voice breaking, that I felt as a young seminarian when I first dared to believe God's love had no limit. Silence fell. Sacred, holy silence. "I've spoken of eternal rest for 60 years," he said. "But now I see it's eternal awakening, eternal becoming, eternal awe." Jonathan stayed seated, overcome by the moment. "Your Holiness," he said quietly, "this came through prayer. It wasn't mine to keep. It was meant to be shared." The Pope nodded with conviction, his keen theological mind already weaving connections, while his heart drank deeply from the beauty of what he had just heard. The room held its breath as he whispered, "This changes everything." His voice gained power, trembling not from weakness, but from awakening. Every funeral homily, every pastoral moment of grief, every teaching we've offered about the afterlife, it all becomes infinitely more hopeful through this lens. He turned toward the cameras, then, as if suddenly remembering the world was watching, "To my beloved faithful across the globe, what you are witnessing is not just an interview. This is a moment of profound discovery. This man, by God's grace, has helped illuminate truths about divine love, truths that should fill every heart with a joy and anticipation we have scarcely dared to imagine." Cardinal Martinez would later call this moment the single most spiritually powerful event I've witnessed in 4 decades of church service. In the studio, no one was immune. Camera operators wiped their faces. Sound technicians looked at one another, stunned, silent. Even veteran Vatican staffers who had seen popes speak to presidents and kings now stood awestruck, not by power but by presence. A grace had descended. Something eternal had touched the temporal. The Pope turned back and remained standing, his frame seemingly re-energized by an inner fire. "Mr. Roumie," he said, his voice now steady with papal authority, yet radiant with personal affection. "Through your openness to prayer and your courage in speaking what the Spirit revealed, you have given the Church, the world, a gift beyond measure. This vision of eternal becoming will forever change how we teach, how we comfort the grieving, and how we prepare souls for the infinite adventure that awaits." Jonathan stood now too visibly shaken by the power of what had transpired. "Your Holiness, I am no theologian. I am just grateful God chose to whisper this into the heart of someone ordinary like me." But the Pope shook his head, eyes firm with conviction. "There is nothing ordinary about obedience to divine inspiration," he said. "What you have done is remind us all that revelation continues, that the living God still speaks, and that His love is deeper, more personal, and more thrilling than we have yet taught." Outside the walls of the Vatican, the world was already reacting. Clips of the Holy Father's tears, his embrace, his declaration about eternal becoming. They ignited a digital wildfire. Tweets, live streams, late-night theology forums, seminary debates, religious leaders from every corner of the faith spectrum were now talking, not about division but discovery, about the soul's infinite journey, about hope. The Pope nodded deeply, his mind alive with theological wonder, but it was his heart awakened and overflowing with awe that revealed the real transformation. The concepts he had just heard didn't merely challenge centuries of doctrinal understanding. They illuminated them. "This changes everything," he said, his voice growing more resolute with every syllable. "Every funeral homily, every pastoral conversation about loss, every teaching about the afterlife, it all becomes infinitely more hopeful." Turning toward the cameras, he remembered the millions watching. My dear faithful. Around the world, he said, his voice trembling yet firm. We are witnessing something extraordinary. This man has helped illuminate truths about God's love that should fill every heart with joy deeper than we've ever known. Cardinal Martinez would later call it the most spiritually powerful moment he had witnessed in over 40 years of service. The Pope, once a man of scholarly curiosity, had shifted into a vessel of overflowing spiritual joy. The atmosphere in the studio was electric. Camera operators wiped away silent tears. Sound technicians struggled to maintain composure. Everyone present sensed it. This was a moment of divine grace. As he returned to his chair, the Pope remained standing, transformed, radiating energy, purpose, and wonder. Mr. Roumie, he said, his voice both papal and personal, through your faithful response to prayer and your courage in sharing these insights, you've given the Church a gift beyond measure. Jonathan rose slowly from his seat, stunned by the gravity of it all. Your Holiness, he said, eyes welling. I'm just grateful that God chose someone as ordinary as me to share this understanding. But the Pope shook his head. There is nothing ordinary about a heart faithful to divine inspiration, he replied. You've shown us that God still reveals new depths of His love through those willing to listen. What followed was unprecedented. Within hours, the internet was ablaze. Social media lit up with hashtags like Lux Eternal Becoming, as people from all walks of life shared their hopes and insights about infinite growth in divine love. News outlets aired footage of the Pope's tearful transformation on repeat. Religious leaders across the world requested transcripts. Theologians began to organize. The world was watching and believing. As the Pope recomposed himself, still shining with joy, he smiled. This interview was meant to explore faith in entertainment, he said with a chuckle. Instead, we found ourselves contemplating the entertainment of eternity. His theological wordplay was more than clever. It radiated the delight of someone who had just glimpsed the edge of heaven. The interview ended with a quiet but profound gesture. The Pope placed his hand on Jonathan's shoulder, a symbol of blessing, a gesture of deep gratitude. Jonathan bowed his head in humble acceptance. In that moment, it no longer mattered who was Pope or actor. There were no titles, no thrones, just two men standing in the light of something holy, unified by truth. As the studio dimmed and cameras stopped, the Pope whispered, "This conversation will require deep reflection and study. But my heart tells me we've touched something real, something eternal." Jonathan nodded, overcome. Your Holiness, I believe that too. The vision I received in prayer feels more alive now than ever before. Cardinal Martinez stepped forward at last. Your Holiness, he said reverently, we've received global requests for transcripts and theological analysis. Leaders from every denomination are responding. The Pope nodded. His heart was open, but his mind, ever the scholar, was already discerning the next steps. Let us proceed with care, he said, but let us not hold back. When grace moves, the Church must listen. The Pope turned to the camera once more. His voice was calm, sure, and full of light. My beloved faithful, what we've witnessed today is a reminder God's love surpasses even our greatest hopes. Eternal life is not just rest, it is becoming. It is an infinite adventure into the heart of divine love. The official interview ended, but the conversation continued privately. The Pope, far from drained, was energized. Vatican staff noted how his spirit had shifted, no longer merely leading, but journeying, growing. Something had changed, and it was unmistakable. In the months that followed, the change only deepened. Pope Leo XIV began weaving themes of eternal becoming into his weekly audiences, his homilies, and his pastoral letters. Gone was the language of finality. He now spoke of growth, transcendence, and limitless love. The world listened and responded. Seminaries added eternal growth to their curricula. Theological journals published special editions. Protestants, Orthodox evangelicals, even non-Christians began studying the conversation. What had started as a prayer shared by an actor became a movement touching millions. Jonathan returned to filming The Chosen, but everything was different. His portrayal of Christ now carried deeper weight, shaped by the truth he had seen and the response it had evoked. His Jesus didn't just offer salvation, he invited every soul into an infinite relationship, one that never stops expanding in joy and love. The Vatican responded officially. A theological commission was formed to study the doctrine of eternal becoming. Scholars gathered from across the world, not to suppress or explain away what had happened, but to explore it, to grow into it, because something sacred had begun. Religious communities across denominations started hosting discussion groups. People found themselves saying things like, "I never thought of heaven like that, but now I can't imagine anything less." The vision of eternity as an endless unfolding of divine love spoke to a hunger that had always been there, waiting for words. That Christmas, Pope Leo XIV referenced the interview in his annual address. Christ's birth, he said, was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of humanity's invitation to infinite growth in divine love. And with that, eternal becoming became part of church. Teaching hope redefined heaven rediscovered. But perhaps the most miraculous part of it all was this. It began not with theologians, not with councils, not even with a vision, but with a simple prayer, a humble heart, and a willingness to speak. Jonathan Roumie's humility throughout reminded the world that God still chooses ordinary people to reveal extraordinary love. The interview became a touchstone in modern religious history, proof that divine insight can move through modern media, that grace can speak through the unlikeliest of vessels. As seminaries studied this moment and churches taught it, one question continued to rise. What is God trying to reveal through you? Perhaps like Jonathan, you felt something stir in your heart, a whisper, a nudge, a truth too beautiful to ignore. Don't dismiss it. The same God who spoke of eternal becoming still speaks today. Are you listening? If this story has stirred something within you, if it has challenged your understanding of heaven or filled you with new hope, we invite you to subscribe, share your experience, and join a global community of hearts longing to grow deeper into God's infinite love. Because the eternal story is still being written, and your next chapter might just begin today. Dear viewers, if you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for opening your heart to this sacredness. This is not just a theological conversation. It is a sacred, invitation. An invitation to believe that your life, your choices, your struggles, your goodness is more important than you think. That your heart is not just for stillness, but for wonder. That God doesn't just love you, now He's always discovering more reasons to love you as you grow. So, what does that mean for you today? It means that your prayers, however faint, resonate into eternity. It means that your silent sacrifices are not forgotten. They are woven into God's eternal tapestry. And that means that no matter how broken you feel, your journey is not over. You are becoming something glorious, and you always will be. Because heaven is not a destination. It is the beginning of an eternal adventure into endless love. Thank you for being a part of this moment. And if this touches you in any way, don't keep it to yourself. As Jonathan said, it was meant to be shared.